September 23, 1986. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Via Veneto during Rome, where businessmen within tailored suits sipped espresso at outdoor cafes, and tourists snapped photographs of the Baroque fountains that had stood for centuries as monuments to papal power and Italian artistry. Among them sat a man who believed he was about to become the most important whistleblower during modern history, convinced his courage would prevent nuclear catastrophe and expose what he saw as a dangerous lie that threatened regional stability and world peace. He had no idea that the beautiful woman scheduled to meet him within exactly 47 minutes had been meticulously preparing for this moment for 6 months, studying his psychological profile, rehearsing conversations, and perfecting a false identity designed specifically to exploit his vulnerabilities, and that he would never see his homeland again as a free man. This is the true story of how one of Israel's most skilled intelligence operatives executed what would become known as the most successful honey trap operation of the Cold War era, a mission that would reshape international nuclear policy, send shockwaves through the intelligence community, and demonstrate the lethal precision of Mossad's global reach. The story begins not within Rome, but rather within the harsh landscape of the Negev desert during southern Israel, where the Dimona nuclear facility had been constructed during the late 1950s with secret assistance from France, at a time when Israel's leaders believed that nuclear weapons represented the only guarantee of survival, within a region where most neighbors had sworn to destroy the Jewish state. The facility, officially designated as the Negev Nuclear Research Center, but known to insiders simply as Machon 2, sprawled across hundreds of acres of barren land, its distinctive dome visible for kilometers around despite Israeli efforts to downplay its significance to international observers. Within its concrete walls and underground chambers that descended 6 levels beneath the desert surface, hundreds of technicians and scientists worked on what would become the Middle East's first nuclear weapons program, a project that Israeli leaders viewed as essential to the nation's survival, but which they kept hidden from international scrutiny through elaborate deception, careful misdirection, and the absolute certainty that exposure would bring diplomatic catastrophe and possibly military intervention from superpowers determined to prevent nuclear proliferation. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me within the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Mordecai Vanunu stood at the window of his modest hotel room within the Trastevere district, watching the evening crowds gather within the piazza below, listening to the sounds of Italian voices mixing with laughter and the clatter of dishes from nearby restaurants. At 31 years old, he had the lean build of a man who had spent years working physical jobs within the unforgiving heat of the Negev desert. His dark hair showing premature gray at the temples despite his youth, his hands bearing the calluses and small scars of industrial work. His hands trembled slightly as he lit another cigarette, the 5th within the past hour, the nicotine doing little to calm the mixture of anxiety and anticipation that had been building within him for days. On the small desk behind him, positioned carefully next to his passport and wallet, lay a manila envelope containing photographs and documents that represented 9 years of his life, working as a technician at the Dimona nuclear facility within southern Israel. Inside that envelope was evidence that Israel possessed an arsenal of between 100 and 200 nuclear weapons, along with detailed photographs of the underground production chambers, technical specifications of weapons designs, and documentation of the facility's capacity to produce enough plutonium for 10 to 12 weapons annually. This was the secret the Israeli government had guarded with absolute determination since the facility's construction during the late 1950s, the secret that could alter international perceptions of Middle Eastern power dynamics, and the secret that Vanunu believed the world deserved to know. The journey to this Roman hotel room had begun not just 6 months earlier, but stretched back through nearly a decade of growing disillusionment and moral crisis that had gradually transformed Vanunu from a loyal technician into someone willing to risk everything to expose what he viewed as his government's dangerous deception. Vanunu had joined the Dimona facility during 1976 as a junior technician, grateful for steady employment within a nation where jobs were not always plentiful, and proud to serve his country during a time when memories of the Yom Kippur War were still fresh and painful. The work was demanding and highly secretive, with workers segregated into compartmentalized sections to prevent any single individual from understanding the full scope of operations. Each person knowing only what was necessary for their specific tasks. Vanunu worked within the underground machining facility located on the 3rd sub-level, where uranium was processed and plutonium was extracted through chemical separation processes, the crucial steps within creating fissile material suitable for nuclear weapons. For the first several years, he asked no questions, did his job efficiently, followed security protocols meticulously, and believed he was contributing to Israeli security during an era when the nation was surrounded by hostile neighbors who had fought multiple wars aimed at destroying the Jewish state. But something changed within Vanunu during the early 1980s, a gradual shift within perspective that began with political awakening and deepened into moral crisis. He started reading philosophy, attending political discussions, questioning the narratives he had accepted without examination throughout his life. He became increasingly troubled by Israel's treatment of Palestinians within the occupied territories, disturbed by what he saw as aggressive militarism masquerading as defensive necessity. His views moved steadily leftward toward pacifism and international cooperation, away from the security-focused nationalism that dominated Israeli political culture. He began to see the nuclear weapons program not as a necessary deterrent but as a dangerous escalation, a violation of international law, and a barrier to peace within the region. The transformation was not sudden but gradual, a slow accumulation of doubts and questions that eventually reached a tipping point. Vanunu found himself lying awake at night, thinking about the weapons being produced beneath the Negev desert, imagining the destruction they could cause, wrestling with his complicity within a program he now believed was profoundly wrong. He confided within a few co-workers, testing the waters, trying to find others who shared his concerns. Most looked at him with incomprehension or alarm, and he quickly learned to keep his thoughts to himself, aware that expressing such views could cost him his job and possibly his freedom. Within 1985, after nearly a decade at Dimona, Vanunu made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He began secretly photographing the facility, smuggling a small camera past security by hiding it within his work clothes, taking pictures of the underground chambers, the control rooms, the plutonium separation equipment, the technical diagrams posted on walls. It was extraordinarily risky behavior, the kind of action that could result within immediate arrest if discovered. But Vanunu had reached the point where the risk seemed necessary, where remaining silent felt like moral cowardice. He took approximately 50 photographs over several weeks, each one representing a potential espionage charge, each one capturing visual evidence of Israel's clandestine nuclear arsenal. After completing his photography, Vanunu resigned from Dimona, claiming he wanted to travel and explore other career options. The security officials who conducted his exit interview seemed satisfied with his explanations, having no reason to suspect that this quiet technician had just committed what Israeli intelligence would later describe as one of the most damaging security breaches within the nation's history. Vanunu left Israel within early 1986, traveling first through Asia and then to Australia, carrying the photographs and his knowledge of Dimona's operations, uncertain exactly what he would do with this dangerous information, but convinced he could not simply let it disappear. Within Sydney, Australia, Vanunu struggled with what to do next. He worked odd jobs, stayed within backpacker hostels, tried to build a new life far from Israel, and far from the memories of underground chambers filled with weapons of mass destruction. But the knowledge weighed on him, kept him awake at night, made him feel like a coward for not taking action. He made contact with the Sunday Times of London, one of the world's most respected newspapers, and after initial skepticism, they sent a reporter named Peter Hunham to interview him. Hunham was an experienced investigative journalist, cautious and thorough, and he spent weeks verifying Vanunu's credentials, examining the photographs, consulting with nuclear weapons experts who confirmed that the images showed genuine nuclear weapons production facilities. The verification process was painstaking. The Sunday Times wanted absolute certainty before publishing such an explosive story, knowing that false claims would destroy their credibility and potentially trigger international incidents. They brought within nuclear physicists who examined the photographs and confirmed that the equipment shown was consistent with plutonium separation and weapons assembly. They interviewed former intelligence officials who reviewed the technical details and agreed that Vanunu had access to genuine classified information. By August 1986, the newspaper was convinced they had the story of the decade, proof that Israel had lied for years about its nuclear program, evidence that would force the international community to confront nuclear proliferation within the Middle East. But what neither Vanunu nor the Sunday Times fully understood was that Israeli intelligence had been watching from almost the beginning. Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service responsible for foreign operations, had sources within media organizations, informants who monitored communications between journalists and potential whistleblowers. When Vanunu first contacted the Sunday Times, alerts were triggered within Tel Aviv, and within days, a file had been opened, investigators had been assigned, and surveillance had begun. By the time Peter Huna met Vanunu within Sydney, Mossad operatives were already watching, photographing their meetings, recording their conversations when possible, building a comprehensive picture of what Vanunu intended to do and how he intended to do it. The decision to capture Vanunu, rather than simply discrediting him or arranging an accident, was made at the highest levels of Israeli government. Prime Minister Shimon Peres was briefed on the situation and authorized a capture operation, concluding that Vanunu needed to be brought back to Israel to face trial, both as punishment and as a warning to anyone else who might consider betraying state secrets. The operation was assigned to Mossad's Special Operations Division, the unit responsible for the most sensitive and dangerous missions, and a team was assembled with one objective: bring Vanunu to Israel alive, preferably without violence, and without creating an international incident that would make the exposure even worse. The team leader was a veteran operative named Yossi Ghibli, a man who had been with Mossad since the 1960s, who had participated within operations across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and who had a reputation for methodical planning and ruthless execution. Ghibli studied everything known about Vanunu: his psychology, his political views, his personal relationships, his vulnerabilities. What emerged was a portrait of a lonely, idealistic man who craved connection and understanding, who felt isolated by his political transformation, who desperately wanted someone to validate his choices and reassure him that he was doing the right thing. This psychological profile would become the foundation for the operation's approach. Ghibli decided that a honey trap operation offered the best chance of success. Rather than attempting a forced abduction, which risked violence and exposure, they would manipulate Vanunu's emotions and psychology, would use his loneliness against him, would make him come willingly to a location where he could be captured quietly. For this approach to work, they needed the right operative, someone who could credibly play the role of a woman Vanunu would find attractive and trustworthy, someone who could maintain a deception for weeks or months without breaking character, someone skilled enough to anticipate Vanunu's reactions and adapt her performance accordingly. The operative they selected has never been officially identified, her real name remaining classified within Mossad files to this day. For the operation, she used the name Cheryl Bentoff, supposedly an American tourist with family roots within Israel, someone who could credibly explain knowledge of Middle Eastern politics while maintaining the cover of a civilian. Within reality, she was one of Mossad's most accomplished field operatives, a woman who had been recruited from the Israeli Defense Forces during the early 1980s. After demonstrating exceptional aptitude for languages, psychology, and the kind of emotional control necessary for long-term undercover work. Cheryl, as we will call her, had grown up within Tel Aviv during the 1960s and 70s, coming of age during a period of almost constant military conflict, when terror attacks were frequent and national survival felt perpetually uncertain. She had served her mandatory military service within intelligence units, where her language abilities and analytical skills were quickly recognized. After her service ended, she had been approached by Mossad recruiters and offered specialized training within a program that prepared operatives for infiltration and manipulation operations. The training was intensive and psychologically demanding, involving not just practical skills like surveillance and communication protocols, but also deep instruction within human psychology, the techniques of building rapport and trust, the methods for maintaining false identities under pressure. Over the following years, Cheryl had participated within numerous operations across Europe and the Middle East, always playing variations of the same role: the sympathetic stranger, the understanding friend, the romantic interest who appears at precisely the right moment within a target's life. She had helped recruit assets, had manipulated foreign officials into providing information, had created situations where targets incriminated themselves or made mistakes that exposed their networks. She was extraordinarily good at her job. With a success rate that made her a prized asset within the service, she could become whoever the mission required, could suppress her real personality so completely that even she sometimes struggled to remember where the performance ended and her authentic self began. For the Vanunu operation, Cheryl underwent weeks of additional preparation. She studied everything available about him, memorizing details from his personal history, his political views, his interests and hobbies. She learned about nuclear weapons and Middle Eastern politics, ensuring she could discuss these topics with apparent knowledge without seeming too expert, maintaining the balance between informed and accessible. She practiced her American accent until it was flawless, worked with dialect coaches to ensure every aspect of her speech patterns matched her cover story. She reviewed psychological profiles prepared by Mossad analysts, studying Vanunu's emotional vulnerabilities, his need for validation, his tendency toward idealism and romance. The plan called for Cheryl to make contact with Vanunu within Rome, where the Sunday Times had arranged for him to stay while they finalized their publication plans. Rome was chosen specifically because it was neutral territory, far from Israel, but familiar to Mossad operatives who had maintained a presence there for decades. The city's status as a tourist destination meant that encounters between strangers were completely normal, providing perfect cover for an orchestrated meeting. The operation's timeline called for a gradual seduction over several weeks, building trust slowly, creating emotional dependency, until Vanunu could be maneuvered into a situation where capture would be straightforward. Cheryl arrived within Rome during early September 1986, settling into an apartment that had been rented by the operations support team, an address within a quiet neighborhood that could serve both as her residence and as the eventual capture site. She spent the first week establishing her presence, visiting tourist sites, frequenting cafes and bookstores, creating the pattern of movement that a genuine tourist would follow. Meanwhile, the surveillance team tracked Vanunu constantly, documenting his routines, identifying the locations where he spent time, noting the times when he seemed most lonely or contemplative. The initial contact was planned for September 10th, at a used bookstore near the Spanish Steps that Vanunu visited frequently. The surveillance team had observed that he spent considerable time there, browsing through political and philosophy texts, sometimes sitting within the small cafe area reading for hours. Cheryl entered the bookstore within the late afternoon, dressed casually but attractively, carrying herself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable within foreign cities. She positioned herself near the history section, deliberately choosing a book on Middle Eastern politics from a shelf near where Vanunu typically browsed. When Vanunu entered the bookstore 20 minutes later, exactly as the surveillance team had predicted, Cheryl was absorbed within her book, occasionally making small notes within a journal. She waited, patient and seemingly oblivious, until Vanunu reached for a book on the same shelf. Then, with perfect timing, she looked up and made a small comment about the topic, something brief and neutral that invited response without demanding it. Vanunu, lonely and eager for intellectual conversation, responded immediately, and within minutes they were engaged within a discussion about Middle Eastern politics, nuclear weapons, and the moral responsibilities of nations. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and throughout it Cheryl displayed the full range of her training. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that encouraged Vanunu to share his views, expressed sympathy for his perspective while never seeming to push for information. She revealed just enough about herself to seem real and relatable, that she was American, that she had family connections to Israel, that she was within Rome trying to figure out what direction her life should take. Every word was calculated, every gesture designed to create connection, but she performed it all so naturally that Vanunu suspected nothing. When they parted, Cheryl suggested they might meet again if he was interested, perhaps for coffee at a cafe she had discovered. Vanunu agreed eagerly, and as he walked away with her contact information, he felt a surge of hope and excitement that had been absent from his life for months. The surveillance team, watching from multiple positions, noted his body language, his animated expression, and reported back to Ghibli that the first phase had been executed perfectly. Vanunu had taken the bait without the slightest awareness that he was being manipulated. Over the following 2 weeks, Cheryl and Vanunu met 7 times. Each meeting was carefully orchestrated, with Cheryl gradually deepening their connection while maintaining the appearance of spontaneity and genuine interest. They walked through Roman gardens, discussing philosophy and politics. They visited museums where Cheryl demonstrated enough knowledge to seem cultured, but not so much that she appeared studied or artificial. They shared meals at small restaurants, where Cheryl listened sympathetically as Vanunu spoke about his growing sense of isolation, his fears about the future, his conviction that he was doing something important but terrifying. Cheryl played her role with consummate skill. She never pushed him to talk about his work or his reasons for being within Rome. Instead, she created space for him to volunteer information, which he did with increasing openness as he came to trust her. She presented herself as someone equally adrift, uncertain about her future, drawn to Rome as a place where she could step outside her normal life and think clearly about what mattered. This parallel between their circumstances created powerful bonding, making Vanunu feel that he had found someone who truly understood his situation. The psychological manipulation was subtle but devastating. Cheryl used techniques that exploited fundamental human needs: the desire to be understood, the need for emotional intimacy, the craving for validation and acceptance. Every time Vanunu expressed doubt about his decision to expose Israeli nuclear secrets, Cheryl offered gentle reassurance, never too enthusiastic, but always supportive enough to keep him committed to his course. When he spoke about feeling lonely and isolated, she touched his hand, maintained eye contact, created physical and emotional intimacy that felt genuine even though it was entirely calculated. By the 3rd week of September, Vanunu was clearly falling for Cheryl. His body language during their meetings showed all the signs: leaning forward when she spoke, finding excuses to touch her, watching her face with intense focus when she talked. He began to confide things he had not mentioned to anyone else, speaking about his childhood, his disappointments, his dreams for a different kind of life. Cheryl mirrored his disclosures with carefully crafted stories from her own fabricated history, creating the illusion of mutual vulnerability and trust. The surveillance reports that Ghibli reviewed each evening made clear that Vanunu was emotionally invested, that he was beginning to imagine a future that might include Cheryl, that he was vulnerable to suggestions about spending more time together. The operation was proceeding exactly according to plan, and Ghibli authorized moving to the final phase. Cheryl would suggest spending the weekend at her apartment, claiming it was within a beautiful area just outside Rome. The apartment was actually the safe house where the extraction team was waiting. Once Vanunu arrived there, he would be subdued, sedated, and transported to a yacht waiting at a coastal marina. From there, he would be taken to international waters and transferred to an Israeli naval vessel for the journey back to Haifa. On the evening of September 23rd, Cheryl prepared for the final act of the operation. She stood before the mirror within her apartment, adjusting the dress she had chosen, reviewing her lines one last time. She felt no particular emotion about what was about to happen. Years of training and operational experience had taught her to compartmentalize, to view targets as problems to be solved, rather than as human beings with lives and relationships and futures that were about to be destroyed. Vanunu had betrayed Israel, had put the nation at risk, and now he would face consequences. It was that simple, that clean, at least within the operational framework she had learned to inhabit. At exactly 7:15, Cheryl walked into the cafe where she had arranged to meet Vanunu. He was already there, sitting at a corner table near the window, wearing his best shirt, and looking both nervous and excited. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that briefly penetrated even Cheryl's professional detachment. For a moment, she saw him not as a target, but as a lonely man who believed he had found connection, who thought this beautiful woman actually cared about him, who had no idea he was walking into a trap. She pushed the thought aside and returned his smile, crossing the room with the easy confidence of someone who has absolute control of the situation. They ordered wine and talked about nothing important for the first hour. Cheryl was a master of the gradual escalation, of building intimacy through shared laughter and knowing glances. She touched his hand across the table, let their knees brush beneath it, maintained the constant low-level physical contact that creates psychological bonds and emotional arousal. Vanunu was clearly smitten, speaking rapidly about his dreams for the future, about how meeting her had given him hope during a difficult time, about how isolated he had felt before she appeared within his life. He did not mention the newspaper expose or his reasons for being within Rome, but Cheryl could sense the weight of secrets pressing on him, could see how desperately he wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself completely to someone he believed would understand. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed, Cheryl gradually steered the conversation toward more personal topics. She told him stories from her fabricated past, tales of disappointment and searching that were designed to parallel his own experiences. She spoke about feeling disconnected from her family, about questioning the values she had been raised with, about seeking something more authentic and meaningful than the conventional life she had been living. Vanunu responded exactly as the psychological profile had predicted, opening up about his own journey, his disillusionment with Israeli policies, his growing conviction that transparency and truth were more important than national loyalty, his sense that he was finally doing something that mattered, even though it terrified him. By the time they finished dinner, Vanunu was holding her hand openly, looking at her with an intensity that mixed attraction with something deeper, a sense of recognition, of having found someone who truly saw him and accepted him completely. When Cheryl suggested they continue the evening at her apartment, claiming she had a beautiful terrace where they could watch the stars and talk without the noise and crowds of the city, Vanunu agreed without hesitation. As they left the restaurant and walked toward the street where a car was waiting, he put his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, playing her role with practiced perfection, even as part of her mind was already moving ahead to the extraction, to the moment when this performance would end and Vanunu would realize the truth. The driver was one of the Mossad operatives, a man named David, who had been with the organization for 15 years, who had participated within dozens of operations, and who understood the importance of maintaining cover even during the final phases. He greeted them with professional courtesy, making small talk about the weather and the traffic, acting exactly like a hired driver picking up a fare. Vanunu, lost within his anticipation of the evening ahead, within his excitement about where this relationship might lead, noticed nothing unusual. The drive took approximately 40 minutes, winding through Rome's outskirts into progressively quieter residential areas. Cheryl kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks, making jokes, ensuring that Vanunu remained relaxed and unsuspicious, giving him no reason to question where they were going or why the route seemed so indirect. The safe house was a 2-story villa with a walled garden, located on a quiet street where neighbors valued privacy and asked few questions. It had been selected specifically for its isolation and its access to the main coastal highway. As they entered through the front gate, Vanunu commented on how beautiful it was, how lucky Cheryl was to have found such a place within this expensive city. She smiled and thanked him, unlocking the door and leading him through the entrance hall toward the terrace she had promised. She offered him another glass of wine, which he accepted, and as he stood on the terrace admiring the view of distant hills and scattered lights, she excused herself for a moment, claiming she needed to change into something more comfortable. Within the bedroom, the extraction team was waiting. They had entered through a back entrance an hour earlier and had been monitoring the situation through concealed microphones placed throughout the house. There were 4 of them, 2 former military personnel trained within close-quarters combat and emergency medical procedures, and 2 support operatives responsible for communication and logistics. Cheryl gave them a brief nod, confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan, then returned to the terrace where Vanunu stood looking out at the lights of Rome shimmering within the distance. He turned when he heard her approach, and the look on his face was one of tender anticipation mixed with nervousness, the look of a man on the verge of intimacy with someone he believed cared about him deeply. What happened next occurred with brutal efficiency that spoke to years of training and dozens of previous operations. As Cheryl approached Vanunu and reached out to touch his face within what appeared to be a gesture of affection, two operatives emerged from the shadows of the doorway behind him. Before Vanunu could react or turn around, one grabbed him from behind, while the other pressed a cloth soaked within chloroform against his face. Vanunu struggled, his eyes going wide with terror and betrayal as he looked at Cheryl, but the sedative worked quickly, his brain flooding with confusion as he tried to process what was happening. Within 30 seconds, his body went limp, and the operatives lowered him carefully to the terrace floor, supporting his weight to prevent injury. Cheryl watched dispassionately as a medic checked Vanunu's vital signs and administered an injection of a longer-acting sedative that would keep him unconscious for several hours. The team worked with practiced precision that comes from repetitive training and operational experience, wrapping Vanunu within blankets to maintain his body temperature and to conceal him from view, then carrying him through the house to a van that had been backed into the villa's garage. Within 15 minutes of his collapse, they were driving toward the coast, and Cheryl was already packing her belongings, preparing to leave Rome on a separate route that would take her through 3 different countries before she returned to Israel. Her part of the operation was complete, executed flawlessly, and she would be back within Tel Aviv within 24 hours, debriefing her controllers and preparing for her next assignment. The drive to the marina took 2 hours along winding coastal roads that were largely deserted at that time of night. During the journey, the medic monitored Vanunu's condition continuously, checking his pulse and breathing every 10 minutes, adjusting his position to ensure his airways remained clear. The extraction had been designed to minimize any physical harm to Vanunu beyond the temporary effects of sedation. Despite viewing him as a traitor, Mossad wanted him alive and healthy enough to stand trial, wanted him able to tell his own story under interrogation so that Israeli intelligence could assess exactly what he had revealed and to whom. The yacht was waiting at a private dock within a small marina north of Rome, registered under a false name to a shell corporation based within Cyprus, crewed by Mossad operatives posing as wealthy tourists on an extended Mediterranean cruise. They carried Vanunu aboard, hidden within a large equipment crate, moving quickly but not frantically, maintaining the appearance of normal loading activities even though it was after midnight. Within 30 minutes, the yacht had cleared the harbor and was heading into international waters, its running lights visible to Coast Guard observers, but its actual cargo completely concealed. Behind them, Rome continued its evening routines, unaware that one of the most significant intelligence operations of the decade had just been executed within its boundaries. The voyage to the rendezvous point took 18 hours of steady sailing through calm Mediterranean waters. During that time, Vanunu regained consciousness twice, disoriented and terrified, his mind struggling to process the disconnection between his last clear memory of standing on a terrace with Cheryl and his current reality of being restrained within a ship's cabin. Each time he woke, his shouts and struggles brought the medical operative, who administered additional sedatives after offering water, and speaking to him within calm, professional tones that contained neither sympathy nor hostility. The operatives spoke little to each other, and not at all to Vanunu beyond what was medically necessary, maintaining professional distance from their captive. They were not there to judge or to explain, only to complete their mission and return him to Israeli custody safely. When the Israeli naval vessel appeared on the horizon within the early morning hours, the transfer was executed with military precision that reflected careful planning and rehearsal. Vanunu, still unconscious from the most recent sedation, was moved from the yacht to the naval vessel within less than 10 minutes, the two craft coming alongside each other just long enough to pass him across with his medical monitoring equipment. The yacht immediately changed course, heading back toward the central Mediterranean to continue its cover as a tourist vessel, while the naval vessel set a direct course for Haifa, pushing its engines to maximum speed. By the time Vanunu next regained consciousness, he was within a holding cell deep within a secure facility outside Jerusalem, and his life as a free man was effectively over. The Sunday Times published their exposé on October 5, 1986, running a comprehensive article with Vanunu's photographs and technical details about the Dimona facility, revealing Israel's nuclear arsenal to the world with a level of detail and documentation that made denial impossible. But the story was incomplete without Vanunu, who had vanished from Rome without a trace weeks earlier, leaving his hotel room fully paid, but his possessions abandoned. For weeks there was intense speculation about what had happened to him. Some believed he had gotten cold feet about going public and had gone into hiding, perhaps accepting payment from Israeli intelligence to remain silent. Others suspected foul play, but had no evidence to support their theories. It was not until November when an anonymous source leaked a photograph to a British newspaper showing Vanunu being transported within Israeli custody, his hands bound and his face showing clear distress, that the truth began to emerge. The photograph had apparently been taken by someone within the Israeli security apparatus who was troubled by the operation, though the individual was never identified, and the leak investigation that followed produced no results. The image created an international scandal, with human rights organizations and foreign governments demanding explanations about how Israel had captured a man from within a foreign country without that country's knowledge or permission. The Israeli government initially denied any involvement within Vanunu's disappearance, issuing carefully worded statements that avoided direct lies while refusing to provide any useful information. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually they acknowledged that Vanunu was within Israeli custody, facing serious charges. They refused to provide details about how he had been captured, citing national security concerns and the need to protect intelligence methods and sources. The Italian government, learning that an international kidnapping had been executed on its soil, issued formal diplomatic protests and demanded a full explanation. But Israel simply stonewalled, and the incident gradually faded from the diplomatic agenda as other crises emerged. Vanunu was tried within secret proceedings on charges of treason and espionage, convicted on the basis of his own photographs and the testimony of security officials about the damage his revelations had caused. He was sentenced to 18 years within prison, a term that Israeli prosecutors argued was actually lenient given the severity of his betrayal. For more than 11 of those years, he was held within complete isolation within a specially constructed cell, forbidden from speaking to other prisoners or receiving visitors beyond his lawyer, subjected to conditions that human rights organizations described as psychological torture, designed to break his spirit and deter others from following his example. Cheryl Bentoff, whose real identity has never been officially confirmed by any government source, disappeared back into the shadowy world of intelligence operations. Over the years, there have been occasional rumors and supposed sightings, stories shared within intelligence circles about the female operative who executed the Vanunu capture. Some reports suggested she continued working for Mossad for another decade, participating within operations across Europe and Asia, before eventually retiring to a quiet life somewhere within Israel under her real name. Other accounts claimed she became disillusioned with intelligence work after the Vanunu operation, troubled by the emotional cost of long-term deception operations, and that she left the service and moved to South America. The truth remains classified, locked away within files that the Israeli government insists must remain secret to protect operational methods and to safeguard operatives who may still be active within the field. The Vanunu case revealed the extraordinary lengths to which Israel would go to protect its nuclear secrets, demonstrating capabilities that sent clear messages to anyone else who might consider exposing state secrets. The operation demonstrated Mossad's capability to execute complex missions on foreign soil, to manipulate human psychology with devastating effectiveness, to coordinate multiple teams across international borders, and to operate with complete disregard for international law and foreign sovereignty when national interests were perceived to be at stake. It also highlighted the profound vulnerability of individuals who challenge powerful governments, showing how easily intelligence services can exploit human needs for connection, validation, and understanding to achieve their objectives. For Vanunu himself, the consequences were catastrophic and permanent. He served his full sentence, enduring years of isolation that left lasting psychological scars, and was released during 2004 to international attention and continued restrictions. But his freedom was only nominal. He remains under severe constraints even today, forbidden from leaving Israel, from speaking to foreigners without government permission, from discussing many aspects of his time at Dimona or his capture. His passport has been confiscated, and he lives under constant surveillance, unable to rebuild his life or to escape the consequences of that decision to trust a woman he met within a Roman bookstore. His life has been defined entirely by that moment of betrayal, by the 30 seconds on that terrace when he realized the truth but could do nothing to save himself. The broader implications of the Vanunu affair extended far beyond one man's fate and reached into fundamental questions about nuclear proliferation, press freedom, whistleblower protection, and the limits of state power. His revelations forced the international community to acknowledge what had long been suspected, but never confirmed, that Israel possessed a substantial nuclear arsenal that it had developed within secret violation of various non-proliferation commitments. The case became a rallying point for nuclear disarmament advocates worldwide, who held Vanunu up as a hero who had sacrificed everything to expose the dangers of nuclear proliferation and the hypocrisy of governments that condemned others for seeking weapons while secretly developing their own arsenals. For Israeli security officials, however, Vanunu remained a traitor who had endangered the nation's survival by exposing its ultimate deterrent, who had violated sacred obligations of loyalty and secrecy, and who deserved every consequence he suffered. Within Israel, public opinion remained sharply divided, with some viewing him as a political prisoner whose punishment was excessive and whose continued restrictions were unjustifiable, while others saw him as someone who had betrayed his country during a time when regional threats remained existential and who should consider himself fortunate to have received only 18 years rather than execution. The operation also revealed the sophisticated evolution of modern intelligence tradecraft, demonstrating how ancient techniques of human manipulation had been refined through psychology, technology, and systematic training into something far more effective than simple seduction. The use of a female operative to seduce and manipulate a male target, the honey trap operation that dates back centuries to biblical times, and classical espionage, had been transformed within the Vanunu case into something approaching psychological engineering. Cheryl Bentoff was not simply an attractive woman sent to seduce a target through physical appeal. She was a highly trained professional who had studied Vanunu's personality, understood his vulnerabilities at a deep psychological level, and crafted a false identity specifically designed to appeal to his particular emotional needs and desires. The ethical dimensions of the operation have been debated extensively within intelligence circles, academic settings, and human rights forums. Supporters argue that Vanunu posed a genuine threat to Israeli security, that his disclosures could have endangered millions of lives by encouraging adversaries to develop their own weapons programs or by undermining Israel's deterrent capabilities, and that the government had no choice but to stop him by any means necessary to protect the nation. They point out that honey trap operations are standard intelligence practices used by services worldwide, that Vanunu was not physically harmed beyond temporary sedation, and that he received a fair trial under Israeli law. Critics counter that the operation violated fundamental principles of human rights and international law on multiple levels. They argue that it constituted kidnapping on foreign soil, that it involved elaborate psychological manipulation that could be considered a form of torture, that it violated Italian sovereignty, and that it set a dangerous precedent for how governments deal with whistleblowers who expose information that governments want to keep secret. They note that Vanunu was exposing a nuclear weapons program that Israel had consistently lied about to the international community, that his motivations were rooted within genuine moral concerns about proliferation, and that his punishment was wildly disproportionate to any actual harm caused by his revelations. What cannot be disputed from an operational perspective is the mission's complete effectiveness. The Vanunu operation was a success by any measure that intelligence services use to evaluate such missions. The target was identified, tracked, manipulated, and captured without violence, without diplomatic incident that could be definitively proven, and without leaving evidence that could be traced back to Israeli intelligence through official channels. The operation demonstrated capabilities that sent unmistakable messages to anyone else who might consider betraying Israeli secrets. You can run to the other side of the world. You can take elaborate precautions. You can work with journalists and lawyers and human rights organizations, but we will find you. We will manipulate your psychology, and we will bring you back to face consequences, no matter how long it takes or how difficult the operation. Within the years since Vanunu's capture, there have been numerous other cases of individuals who challenged powerful governments by exposing classified information and who faced severe consequences that followed patterns similar to what Vanunu experienced. Edward Snowden, the former National Security Agency contractor who exposed American surveillance programs, fled to Russia to avoid prosecution and has lived there within exile ever since, unable to return home or to live freely. Chelsea Manning, the Army intelligence analyst who leaked classified military documents to WikiLeaks, served 7 years within military prison under conditions that United Nations officials described as cruel and inhumane before her sentence was commuted. Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, who published classified information from multiple governments, spent 7 years confined within the Ecuadorian embassy within London to avoid extradition and now faces decades within prison if extradited to the United States. The Vanunu case established a template for how modern governments respond to those who expose secrets the government wants to protect, demonstrating that sophisticated intelligence operations combined with prosecutorial power can effectively neutralize whistleblowers while maintaining plausible deniability about the most controversial aspects of how they were captured. This template includes extensive surveillance to track the target's movements and communications, psychological profiling to identify vulnerabilities, manipulation operations that exploit those vulnerabilities to maneuver targets into situations where they can be captured, and subsequent prosecution under laws that allow for secret trials and severe punishments. The role of personal relationships and human vulnerability within intelligence operations has also received increased attention and study within the wake of the Vanunu case. As intelligence agencies have become more sophisticated about exploiting emotional and psychological factors, intelligence agencies around the world routinely exploit human vulnerabilities using friendship, romance, family connections, professional respect, or ideological sympathy to manipulate targets into providing information or into making mistakes that expose themselves or their networks. The Vanunu case highlighted how effectively even intelligent, careful, politically aware individuals can be deceived when operatives are trained specifically to identify and exploit their particular psychological needs and vulnerabilities. Vanunu was not stupid or naive, despite how his capture might make him appear within retrospect. He was well-educated, politically sophisticated, aware of the risks he was taking, and cautious about his security within many respects. But he was also lonely and idealistic, struggling with the weight of the secrets he carried, desperate for connection and validation during a difficult time within his life. These human qualities made him vulnerable to an operative who was trained to present herself as exactly the person he needed her to be, who studied his psychology, who crafted a false identity specifically designed to appeal to his particular vulnerabilities, and who executed her role with patience and skill over several weeks. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts within the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.